Hello and welcome to video 20 for the environmental lecture series. This one's on ecosystem approach to conserving terrestrial ecology, and it's going to get into some forestry and some grasslands parts as well. And so we're starting with ecosystem approach. And in the previous lecture, we talked about extinction and kind of HIPCO and how species are being pressured by human activity. And so the general trend or the generally accepted idea for preventing species from going extinct is rather than focus on one specific species, like say the giant panda, we should focus instead on the ecosystem. Come on, oh, there we go. And panda. We should focus instead on the ecosystem and preserve the whole ecosystem, this kind of delicate balance between all the different organisms living in an area. And so this map here is the United States, and the red spots is the concentration of rare species. And so you can see that it's not so much a countrywide issue, these really endangered species. It's more of these hot spots and what's going on in these areas. So the first one to point out to you, we've got a area of the Appalachian Mountains here where we've got some concentration of endangered species. And so this elevated deciduous forest here on the East Coast is one that's worth conserving because there's a lot of species we would protect by conserving it. Some of the other big ones, the biggest one here is Hawaii. Look at these red spots. You can hardly see the islands underneath them. They're so big. There's so many species there that are in danger, mostly from invasives, like the last lesson showed you. But these are all kind of these areas. And so rather than preserve and focus just on that one species, what can we do to save the panda? It's more what can we do to save the area the panda needs to survive, right? We need to get large territories because they're pretty big animals. We need to get an awful lot of bamboo growing because it's the only thing they're going to eat. And we also need to give them space because our interruptions can interrupt their relatively rare breeding sessions, and that can cause less new pandas to be born. So let's focus on the ecosystem. And so there's kind of three ways we can go about focusing on the ecosystem. This picture right here is a deciduous forest of Falcon State in Venezuela, and it is one of these hot spots that needs protecting. And the ocelot and the long-nosed bat here are both two species that are found within this deciduous forest. And so by protecting the forest, we have the opportunity to protect these two kind of banner endangered species, and along with it all the other plants and animals. And so there's a lot of other things that are endangered in here that are not kind of cool and cute like this cat, or like creepy and also cool like this bat, but these two are the ones that can sell the calendars and be on postcards and stuff like that. And so we want to focus on protecting this area to preserve not them but also everything they need to survive. Like the ocelot hunts mostly in the treetops, and so if you remove the trees in this deciduous forest to build cattle farms or something like that, you're taking away what it needs to survive. So it's not going to help if the trees are gone to preserve the ocelot because it's got nowhere to live. Let's preserve the area the ocelot lives in and give it the chance to survive without us really intervening. So these are the three ways we can do it. We can restore the habitat, right? So if we have damage this in some way, maybe we could go back in and restore it. If we've clear cut some forest, we could replant or allow them to regrow. We could rehabilitate the environment, and so if the environment is lacking something that is due to human action, we can make it so it's reintroduced, right? So maybe a tree species has gone extinct here due to selective cutting. We could reintroduce that tree species. Or then replacement. And so we could create artificial wetlands. If we're talking about a wetland, we can completely replace the trees if they've all been removed. So these are the three ways we can go about helping out the ecosystems. So this is kind of the 4-point plan to the ecosystem approach. How do we do this on a global scale? And the first one of this is to map all the ecosystems and get an inventory of the species provided. So this is a tedious task here. Luckily, it's kind of already been done for us, but is this looking at what do we have to work with, what's out there right now, And then once we do that, we can hone in on the most endangered ecosystems. So rather than focusing on the endangered species, let's focus on the ecosystems which are in jeopardy of disappearing, and along with them, the species that live there and the ones that are in the immediate threat. Because without the ecosystem to live within, the species aren't going to be able to survive. And so once we've located these most endangered, we can kind of order them. All right, this is our priority 1, this is priority 2, etc. And so we would seek to restore, and that could be any of those 3 ways before. We could rehabilitate, we could restore it, or we could reinvent it with something completely new. But can we make this ecosystem viable again? And then after we have restored it, so we've restored it, it's back and it's working, let's not go in and develop the area in a way that continues to degrade it. And so let's make it biodiversity friendly. And so there's a lot of ways that that can happen. One of the real big ones when talking forests is instead of clear cutting new forests to build croplands or palm oil plants in Indonesia, is let's use land that's already been cleared and isn't being used for something, right? So if we had a farm that went out of business, let's use their land rather than clear cutting fresh land. So that's one simple example. This is the hotspots. So I told you that they've already made the list. These are the 34 biodiversity hotspots where the ecosystems are in jeopardy of going extinct. And so look at this. We've got the Amazon rainforest here. It's a pretty large one. We're going to talk a little bit in the next slide, I believe, about Costa Rica, which is right down in here. We've got a little tip down here, the Everglades in Florida, our closest one to home. You've got Indonesia and all of these Pacific islands out here that are in jeopardy. So there's a lot of countries that are in jeopardy, and you can see it's kind of this global problem. But these are the areas we really need to focus on conserving and preventing further degradation to happen. One of the ways we can do that is through national parks. And so national parks exist not just in the United States. There are 120 countries nationwide that have them. And I think the total is right over 1,100 national parks. And so these are designed to kind of develop the area in a biodiversity friendly way. So we're trying to turn this environment into a way that it's going to produce money and allow people to enjoy it and see what's kind of out there. And so one of the downsides to this is they're a good idea, but it's tough to enact in principle. And so you end up with these human activities taking place within national parks in the United States and all over the world. And a lot of this is just human action, that we've got area outside the national parks that it wouldn't need to happen in, but it does happen within the national parks. And the people at White Oak were talking about this with us with the Democratic Republic of Congo. So they have big issues with this part, especially the miners, and just coming into the land and destroying the forest to get at the minerals under the ground. And then once they get discovered, they clear house and disappear. So any of these are a problem. This is the United States National Park System. So you can see them all over the country here. The biggest problem with the United States national parks is population and overcrowding. The national park system in the United States, I believe the number is like 73 million visitors every year. And the most visited national park is right here. Some of you may have been to it. It's Great Smoky Mountains National Park. They see, I think it's something like 9 million people a year, which is a lot of people in the park. That puts a lot of stress on the environment. So that's a lot of roads and parking lots to support that many people. You need trash cans because those people are all going to bring waste with them, food wrappers, water bottles, air pollution from the vehicles they're using to drive around. The people that are camping in the campground might be tempted to cut down trees around their campsite and use them as firewood. So there's a lot of problems with having a lot of people within the parks. Some of these parks also suffer from like all-terrain vehicle use, like ATVs or dirt bikes really destroy grasslands out in the Midwest. Jet skis up in the Everglades, right, or airboats in the Everglades. Some of you may have been on those types of rides before. They're really destructive to the grasses and the sediments, the animals that live in the sediments in those areas. So there's a lot of issues that face the United States national parks, the biggest of them being just too many people in there. and it's a problem that's kind of tough to solve. It's great that people are interested in coming, but by bringing those people into the park, you are bringing some risks and some degradation with them. One of these examples of a ecosystem approach really helping out is gray wolves in Yellowstone. So this is a really interesting case study where in the early 1990s, I'm not going to try to put a date on it, they brought gray wolves back to Yellowstone. Gray wolves left Yellowstone, hunted out, and moved on. And they weren't there for the longest time. And they came up with a plan and a strategy to reintroduce them. And they thought it was really going to benefit the ecosystem in Yellowstone. And so they brought them in. And anytime you do something, there's people that opposed it. And so you can see these people at some sort of town hall meeting here or some sort of rally saying that they don't want the gray wolves fight the wolf reintroduction, and they didn't want them brought in. Since the reintroduction, though, you can see the positive effects that have taken place. And so we got a couple graphs here. First graph here is our wolf population, and so you can see this is about 1993. We're at 0 wolves, and then they introduced the first 20 or so wolves, and over time the population is generally trending upwards. It looks like we've kind of exceeded carrying capacity and are kind of oscillating around it right now. While that was happening, check out the elk population. And so elk's the primary food of gray wolves. Previously, no predators, so we're at like 17,000 elk in existence. And look at how much their population has been under control. Right, it's dropped all the way down to what was probably about 7,000. So about 10,000 elk that we've lost from the environment. And you might think, this is terrible. We're losing the elk population. With no elk in Yellowstone, we're going to have a lot less of a productive environment. But by eliminating the elk, or some of the elk, right, we still do have elk, but by culling their numbers and lowering that population, there's been a really positive increase elsewhere. And one of the biggest ones here is in the trees of Yellowstone. And so with this huge number of elk that we had previously, that requires a lot of trees to consume. And elk really can't reach the tops of the big trees. What they can do is they can eat the young trees. And so you weren't seeing a lot of young trees in Yellowstone, especially in the areas where you had elk. And so if you look at the number of trees since they were reintroduced, since the wolves were reintroduced, something like Cottonwood here where there was almost none of them. And then now we've got this huge number here on the rise up. The size of the willow trees has shot up in correspondence to it. The number of beaver, right? Beaver, you'd think wolves would eat the beaver. Well, they may eat some beaver, but the big impact is that there's now trees for the beavers to eat around the water, right? The elk like water, and so they eat the trees closest to the water supplies. Now they can't really stay in those areas. The wolves are going to push them out, eat a few of them, but they'll keep the elk moving so they can't just chew one area of all the baby trees. And so the beavers have come back, and beavers build dams, and so the streams have formed ponds, and it's really had this huge impact. Nature reserve is another type. So a nature reserve is one that's kind of strictly for nature and completely eliminates human activity. That's different than the national park, where people can come in, they do hiking trails and camp and stuff. And so the nature reserve number is advertised, I think, as 13%, but really only 5% of that is strictly protected from human habitat. So this 13% could allow things like hiking on it, or biking, or hunting, that kind of stuff. 5% of this, no access. Humans cannot go in. So 5% might seem like a lot of the Earth, but that's really leaving us with the other 95%, and we're just one of the many species here. 20% is kind of what we would hope it to be. And this is public land here, right? So the nature reserves are government-owned land, public land. That's supplemented currently, and it's going up by private. And North Florida Land Trust is a private group of people that their focus is preserving North Florida. And so they're creating their own nature reserves. They're buying land, either through their own trust funds or through donations from companies, and that land is not going to be developed. And that's their goal, is to not develop this land. And so here's the lands that they own, or the properties that they own. I think their biggest one is right here, donated by CSX. I think it's something like 640 acres of wetland that is never going to be developed as long as they stay true to their plan, but it's never going to be developed. So this is a nature reserve that has strict humans are not allowed in it. So there's some of their land that they've acquired, and they're still looking to acquire more. Costa Rica is really the forefront of this. They are top of the line, environmentally friendly, and really what Costa Rica has done is they've made the decision where we've got these great, wonderful rainforests, and we could cut them down and build farms and stuff here, or we can turn this into a tourism country, ecotourism, and we can sustain and protect these nature reserves, and that will in turn bring the same amount of money, the same profits that cattle ranching would do through the tourists. And so they're a great tourist destination. In the year 2017, that'd be not this summer, but next summer, this is 2016, the school at Episcopal here is going to take a trip out to Costa Rica. So if you'd like to see Costa Rica and what I'm talking about, feel free to join the trip. I'll be a chaperone, so it'll be kind of a cool time. But anyways, they've got these huge parks, mega reserves, and it's designed to sustain their biodiversity. And so there's three parts that they've got. They've got a buffer zone, which is around the outside to keep people's distance from it. You can enter it, right? But it's there to eliminate people. And then the core area is really the meat and potatoes of their reserve. This is the part they're really strictly protecting. And so the buffer protects the core, right? You might have cars driving by the outside here. You might have houses out by the buffer zone, but there's nothing in the core, and they're protected by the buffer zone. And then in between them, we've got habitat corridors. And so this is a really kind of interesting concept where, let's say you've got two parks here or two reserves. That land between them can be created as a habitat corridor. And so you might have a species that requires this whole area to survive. And so this one single reserve wouldn't be enough space, and that one single reserve wouldn't be enough space. But if the species is able to move from one or to the other between the two, that might be enough territory for it to hunt its prey, if we're talking about a tiger, or for it to find other pandas if we're talking about a panda bear. So this habitat corridor is a really interesting concept, and it's a way that you can kind of piece these reserves in around previously developed areas. We've got a little bit of forest here. I know this video is running long. I'll try to get through it. There are three types. We've got old growth forests up here where you've got many different size trees. You can see there's some real small trees. We've got these really big trees. These are forests that have been around for a long time. And so the small trees are the offspring of the big trees. Big tree will fall over every now and then, and a smaller tree will get a chance to become a big tree. But they have not been cut down for hundreds of years. And in some cases, these old growth forests, you could put an extra 0 on that and make it thousands of years. A second growth forest is one that has been disturbed by human activity for some reason. It might be logging, it might have been a forest fire, something like that. This is our second growth forest here. Characteristic of the second growth forest is all the trees are roughly the same size. And so that means at some point there was a catastrophic event that eliminated all the trees from the area. And so this is secondary succession. Right, secondary succession. I'm not going to write out the whole word, but there you go. Secondary succession that has reestablished this environment. And so these are not as stable as the old growth forests. And then the last part is a tree plantation. Those of you that know me know that I worked on a Christmas tree farm. Here it is right here. Welcome to the tree farm. This is one single tree planted in these nice orderly rows like this. And they can be cut down as they need to be. And so this is kind of the process of the tree farm. We cut down the trees, replant the trees, and then once they're big enough, we can recut them. And so it's kind of this continuous cycle that can be done sustainably depending on the type of tree you're growing. And so we can use this for furniture, we can use it for Christmas trees, building supplies, etc., etc. A couple different logging practices to know. There are three main kinds. There's selective cutting, where you would go into the forest and choose and select which tree you want. So you might focus on a certain species, you might focus on a certain age or certain size of tree, and this one allows the soil to kind of stay in place because you haven't removed all the trees. Unfortunately, though, by taking out some of them, you are removing some of that habitat, right? So these trees provide habitat for other animals, and you also open up the area for new trees to come in. And so if it's an invasive tree that comes in, that could be a problem. Clear cutting is where you remove everything, just completely destroy the tree population, really subject to erosion and flooding and mudslides because there's nothing to hold this in, and so it really wears out. Strip cutting is another one where you cut a strip and then you allow it to regrow, and then you cut another strip, and so you're not as susceptible to erosion. While this area here between them might erode, you've got this buffer zone here, and it keeps the stream pretty clear. You can see just how dirty this stream is here because of all the sediment running down into it. I'm going to leave this part up here, but this is actually where I'm going to cut off. I don't want to go too much past 20 minutes. So again, I apologize for the length of the video, but know that this is the last one in Unit 5. These things up here are all reasons or ways that we could reduce our impact through logging. So we have the biggest impact on forests. This is what we can do to reduce it. Please hopefully you took some notes. Come ready for discussion tomorrow. Thank you for watching.